Callaway planted native grass alone and others in pots with knapweed. In the latter group, half the samples were treated with activated carbon, a substance that would neutralize at least some of the toxins released by the knapweed roots. The results are astonishing.
So these grasses that I'm showing you here were all planted at the same time. This one's growing by itself, no big surprise, but it's huge. It doesn't have any competitors.
Nice happy plant.
Right? It's a nice happy plant, nothing affecting it. This one is growing with a knapweed, obviously, and there's no activated carbon in the soil. So this plant is, you know, what, 50 times smaller.
Knapweed is absolutely waging war with its neighbors, but it's doing it not just in the standard light and nutrient sort of way, it's also doing it with these chemical interactions in the soil, and so it's adding this whole new dimension. This chemical warfare is novel, and it has these abilities to kill the native plants, which is very rare among plant species.
But there's one native plant that can fight back. These colorful little flowers belong to the wild lupin, and lupins can launch a chemical counterattack of their own. Like their knapweed neighbors, lupin roots release a chemical called oxalic acid to get food from the soil. And amazingly, that chemical also acts as a defensive shield against the knapweed toxins. But these feisty little plants don't just defend themselves, they also seem to protect the plants around them.
My lab has shown in the field that not only does lupin seem to do well against knapweed, if we experimentally plant grasses near lupin in a knapweed patch, they do much better next to lupin. It's a really exciting thing to consider in terms of potential ways that plants may interact that really has not been explored. It's a totally behavioral sort of analogy.
So what does this complex behavior teach us about the social lives of plants? Well, when you look around at the incredible diversity of the plant world, you start to realize that knapweed's style of killer competition isn't the dominant form of social interaction among plants. If it were, we'd be looking at far fewer plant species.
So what we see in the natural world isn't just struggle for resources. It's a balance of positive and negative interactions that sometimes is beneficial, sometimes is detrimental, but it all depends on the environment. There is no plants compete and that's end of story. That idea is dead.
So what other forms of social interaction are at play in the plant world? If plants aren't the lone wolf competitors we once imagined them to be, are they as sociable as the animals that eat them? For herd animals, like these elephants, recognizing family members is an important part of social life. In fact, for many animals, kin recognition is an essential skill.
Animals use kin recognition for two things: to recognize their relatives and avoid mating with them, and to benefit their relatives in social interaction. So animals may give off warning calls if there's a predator near, only if their relatives are near, but not if strangers are around. And animals will generally avoid mating with relatives. It's well known that plants have a mechanism to at least avoid mating with themselves, so it's a kind of kin recognition. But people hadn't known if plants could benefit their relatives in social interactions, and that's what we've been working on.
When she began her research, Dudley knew that plants could sense the presence of other plants above the ground. Using photo or light receptors in their leaves, they can sense when they're being shaded by a neighbor and respond by growing taller or in a different direction to compete for light. And plant roots have a similar ability.
People have shown that plant roots would respond differently to their own roots than to a neighbor's root. So the question is, can they do anything? Do they know who they're interacting with? So I said, well, this is a good place to look for kin recognition, because wouldn't it be cool? So this is the right habitat.
So Dudley and student Amanda File headed for the shores of Lake Ontario on a hunt for a very special kind of plant to see if its roots behave differently when growing next to its kin. It's called sea rocket, and its reproductive behavior made it ideal for a kinship study.
Ah, here's a good-sized plant.
Sea rocket produces two different kinds of seed pods, one of which clings to its mother, resulting in seedlings that often grow up side by side in a family group.
It's in flower, and it's got a few big fruits. This is probably the biggest one. And because they're annual plants, the mother plant dies, can get buried by, by the wind and the waves, and so you have a whole bunch of seedlings potentially coming up from that buried dead mother plant. So they would all be siblings sharing the same mother.
And family members were exactly what Dudley was after. In a series of experiments, she and File planted some sea rocket siblings together and others with unrelated plants. After a few weeks, they cleaned the roots, weighed them, then checked to see if there was a difference between those growing with siblings versus strangers.
I was extremely shocked because we got exactly what we predicted. And this doesn't happen often in science. We're predicting a response. We found exactly that. With siblings, there was lower root allocation than with strangers.
In other words, strangers grew more roots to compete for food, while siblings politely restrained their root growth. So was that evidence of a family sharing resources? Was it proof of altruistic behavior?
Altruism is defined as doing a benefit to others at some cost to yourselves. And it's one of the things that get involved by kin selection, but it's not the only one. Two plants that do not compete avoid paying that cost of competition, and because they're benefiting a relative, their genes are passed on to a greater extent.
But whether it's a case of enlightened self-interest or a selfless sharing of resources, no one knew how these plants were identifying their kin. Dudley knew that all plants exude chemicals from their roots, so maybe sea rocket roots were identifying one another via chemical signals. To test that theory, Dudley and her collaborators turned to Arabidopsis, a fast-growing plant that exhibited the same kin response as sea rocket. When they placed two siblings in water and blocked all chemical signals, the seedlings suddenly started ramping up their root growth. Without the ability to chemically communicate, siblings had become strangers.
Is it communication? Are they deliberately sending a signal? That we don't know. That's something that we can't answer yet.
Since then, Dudley's lab has gone on to document sibling responses in at least 3 other species of plants. Now, she and File are moving on to study some of the longest-lived plants on Earth.